Welcome back to another episode of the Me to You Marketing Show. I am here with my co-host, Dr. Matthew Champagne.
Hey, friends.
And the lovely Anita Toth.
Hello, everyone.
And this episode is season 1, episode 6, where we're talking about the psychological trigger in marketing of using obedience and authority. And we would also like to juxtapose that with one of Dr. Champagne's principles, using survey to really create a better relationship with your audience, as opposed to the surveys that we know, which can be maybe on the good side boring, on the bad side destructive. He's managed to figure out a way to make it so that not only is survey usable, but actually can create a relationship with you and your customers in your business. So I'd like to do something a little different this episode and actually start there. I'd like to start, Dr. Champagne, with your principle this episode of participation and ownership. Do you mind talking about that principle a little bit before we get into the rest?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Participation ownership principle 4 of the 9 principles is actually has 4 layers to it, but I think the one layer is most applicable here, and that's called buy-in. And buy-in means buy-in from both the person that you're asking for feedback, your people, and also buy-in from your side, from those you're going to give the results. So an easy example of both of those is, imagine buy-in from those that are getting the results. So imagine at a university, you get feedback from your students, and then you present those results to a tenured faculty member who might say, well, why do I care? I'm tenured. The student's feedback isn't really, useful to me. So you need to get buy-in from the people who are going to get the results, but you also need buy-in from the people you're asking. And you have this huge obstacle because most people find surveys to be annoying and boring, as you said, and they're just conditioned that nothing will happen from this. Nobody ever fills out a survey and then gets a call from the company to say, hey, thanks for filling out that survey. Because of what you said, we made this major change. What you said really made a difference. That never happens. So people already have this resistance and they're not really bought in. So we talk about survey fatigue. If you ask your people more than once, they're going to get fatigued. And my thought is that means you're doing it wrong. When I do a survey, we ask people questions, then we show them how what they said made a difference. And then they respond in greater numbers. So it happens every time we do a survey, you get kind of a smaller response rate. And then when they see that what they said made a difference, you've closed the loop and shared the results, then they respond in greater numbers. And again, and again, and again, there's never survey fatigue when you do a survey correctly, because now they have buy-in. And that's what principle 4 is about.
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating that I've watched this in action when Dr. Champagne has presented this in live events over multiple days, that the first day people are like, yeah, it's another survey. And then the minute that they get the results back in real time on that first day, and not only that, but the speaker will actually say things like, hey, you're from here and you're from here, and I see people are from here. All of a sudden people perk up and they hear themselves in the survey results, and the people get excited to fill out the surveys then, and we have even more participation. But I'll tell you, the other thing that I noticed, and I told Dr. Champagne this, is that people started really hanging on to the entirety of the presentations as well, because there was a respect there that we were listening to them, so they absolutely were going to listen to what we were presenting. And that was very remarkable to me, because where we were at, the type of event we were at, was just so full of information, 8 hours of information every day, and yet nobody seemed fatigued from receiving the information. There was no one falling asleep. There was no one really doing their own projects, and we're talking 300 people. So yeah, when we can demonstrate that we're hearing other people, boy, the buy-in is just pretty wonderful.
Yeah, and that's what Sideways Survey is about. You've heard me talk about that as the method for doing this. And you've essentially created in your live event an unpaid focus group, because now they're attending to every detail because they know they're going to be asked about it. And so they're just kind of storing up and noting things. And the results from the surveys get more and more complex because they're finding little details of things that they would never, ever raise their hand and admit. They'll write in the survey, just little annoyances, little things. This could be better. This could be better. And it's just amazing how much people tune in and report once you've demonstrated to them that what they have to say is important.
Would you say that people feel a stronger affinity and identity to whoever's presenting through the survey process?
Absolutely. That's one of the huge impacts is, how we would feel. You heard my voice. What I said made a difference. You demonstrated to me that you cared, that you corrected or modified something. And it could be just I'm doing a survey right now as we're recording. They're administering the third survey in 2 days. So they do, one every few hours during a live event, and the same patterns occurring. They're getting bigger. The response rates are growing. But I just saw the data this morning, and someone said, where I'm sitting, I love the view out the window, but I can't see the people on the other side of the room because it's so bright. Well, they could have just raised their hand. They could have walked over to the blinds and changed the blinds themselves. They sat there with their phone and typed all this in so that then the person could respond to it. And the leader did just that. Didn't say anything, just went over there and adjusted the blinds and then told everybody in the room, hey, let's switch up seats here. If you want a good view of the window, you can sit over on this side of the room. That's the best viewing. So he addressed it. And the person who wrote that absolutely knew it was because of their feedback, and probably had a big smile on their face that their voice was heard and things changed. And so it makes that leader in the room just look caring. And that's where you want to be.
Well, and I like the fact that this level of survey, it honors not just the extroverts, but the introverts as well, because a lot of times some of our best participants in feedback come from our introverts who've really done the deep work, the deep thinking work on our platform, and yet we never have an opportunity to really hear the fruit of their labors unless we ask the right way. So I really love this platform for doing that. And, I think it's very easy if we're not into doing something like that, if we're not into asking our audiences in a way that actually increases participation as opposed to making them cringe and go, oh, great, another 52 question survey, yay. It looks to me that people are doing some other tactics instead. And one of those tactics that we wanted to talk about was this definition of obedience versus authority. So take, your same live event, for example, and, in order to get buy-in over a 3-day event, there may be some asks that get asked during that event from the speaker. Anita, did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, coming from the digital realm as a marketer, it's amazing to see the different tactics that have been used over the years to try to encourage this buy-in that Matt just talked about for surveys and different things like that. And one of them is, free iPad, or we'll give you a discount to this course, or whatever they think that the audience might want. Free books. I've seen that. I've seen people stand up on stage and say, hey, I'll give you a free signed book if you do X. Or, online we see it where it might be a live event, but it's not face-to-face. So something like a Facebook Live or Instagram Stories, something like that, or Snapchat, where they'll say, all $1,000 to the person who does this, and this, as a way to try to encourage people to behave in the way they want. So surveys are similar. We're trying to encourage people to take these surveys, so they use monetary tactics as a way to do it. What I would love, and it ties really nicely with what Matt just said, is why not get up and give something that's even more valuable than the iPad they might have, or the version of the book they already have, the same book they have is just unsigned, and give time. give face-to-face time. How about 30 minutes with me to discuss X, or I can help you with this, or one of my team members will help with this, and then I will come back and look over it and give my thoughts. I think you would have far more buy-in. Why? Because it's that, Matt touched on it, the caring, the personal element we're looking for. And so those are the tactics that are currently in use. They're all based on money or physical products instead of what we all want most. Like, you know, if I had an opportunity with someone that I really respected to just sit down with them for 15 minutes, you better believe I'd be filling out the whole 52 question survey and, you know, and running up probably in person to hand deliver it for that opportunity. I think what Matt has done is given that we take time afterwards to look at the responses and then let people know that, yeah, we actually do make these changes because we care. We value your time and ours. And so I would love to see that. I'd love to see one of these, you know, big name people who's super busy to offer their time instead of a physical product.
Yeah, and I like that concept of the fact that when we do give something in a survey, to have something given back to us, the respect of response. And I do believe that that's really what's baked in a leveraged fashion to what Matt's talking about. So that's a point well taken, Anita. And I think getting back to this concept of buy-in a little bit and talking about how methods that we see marketers have taught us to achieve more buy-in for identity, buy-in for ideas, buy-in for even getting any feedback at all on any kind of a product or service that we're offering, is this concept of obedience versus authority. And Matt, do you mind talking to us a little bit about what that concept actually is before going into the study information that you have on that?
Sure. I'll just outline it. You know, you guys can go deeper. I mean, when I think of authority, I think of two ways. One is authority from the stage. I've been to events where, you know, the guru on stage, you know, commands authority. They're on the stage, they're the leader, and has an awful lot of power and sway, and can use that for good or for not so good. And I've seen this also in what the gurus have told us about our own marketing materials, saying, you know, you have to establish authority. They use it as a tactic, though, just like all these tactics, you know, that we're talking about. They're actually very deep principles that have a lot of ways of using them, but in their mind, it's just a tactic. First, you demonstrate authority. How do you do that? And then they kind of lay out, well, here's the things you do. 1, 2, 3, you do this, and now you've established yourself as an authority. You know, that's my view when I see this. Figured Anita had a little more depth to say on this, being the online marketer of the group.
Do you want me to jump in and say a little more about it?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so with authority, you know, when you go, I guess I'm just going to step back a tiny bit and look at historically where was authority given. It was either through, you know, you went formally to school, you had your, you know, X number of years of training. Let's say you come out doctor, lawyer, engineer, whatever it is. For religion, it would be, you know, years there too, training. And then we get into this online world where we no longer are seeing, those are professions where you would see people, you know, historically face to face. You would know, you would see their, you know, degrees on the wall, all of that. But you get into this online world, and like Matt said, almost authority becomes a checkbox where it's like, and you know, Matt had mentioned this earlier, I'm going to bring it up again, is this concept that you only have to be slightly further ahead in your knowledge and experience than the people you're teaching. That, you know, perhaps you've only done this once. We see this all the time with advertising that, you know, I got so-and-so return on ad spend, you know, whatever it is, 100% return on ad spend. I did this, this, and this. They create a little course around what they did, and then they sell it as if it's applicable to everybody. And it's not. And it becomes so hard in the online world to figure out who has authority when you can just sort of give it to yourself. The training periods are very short. And that becomes, so this is where I got burned in the beginning. There's a couple of courses I took. I did my research. It's what I do to try to find out, should I buy into this? Should I not? And it turned out that their authority was just something they had done previously. And for some of these people, it was like several years ago they were using these methods, no longer really applying to today, but that was their authority. And it was only after I spent the thousands of dollars to buy the course and get into it that I realized, like, these people don't know what they're talking about. They're not an authority on this. And with my limited knowledge, I could figure that out. But unfortunately, it was only after getting into the course and paying my money, and those became very painful lessons. And so we have this whole shift on, what was traditionally an authority figure, and what we have now in the online world, where literally you can become an authority after a few hours or a week or so, just because you have a tiny bit of experience and you say so.
I'd like to talk a little bit about what constitutes authority online, which is, and sometimes offline. And this concept of social proof, either through likes or shares. We talked about that a little bit last time. And I think in the offline world, that translates into celebrity. And, especially since you work so closely with Facebook in your practice, Anita, do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this has become the way that we now view people of authority, and it's really because they go from being, somebody. There's one person in particular, and he's done very well with this. Totally hidden his background, but he's an excellent marketer. He's great at using all the different social media platforms, and he's built a huge following to the point now that he is tipping into kind of celebrity. He certainly hangs out with a lot of them and makes sure to take a lot of pictures of himself with those celebrities, again, to elevate where he's at. And the social proof becomes equated with authority. So he has, 20 million followers and on this platform, and he has this many, and he's on pretty much every social media platform. So he's omnipresent. And that has become the way that we now judge authority. That if you don't have, let's say you are a really legitimate business, maybe you've come from the offline world, you're coming online, and people see that your social media following or your social proof is very small, then they automatically equate that you don't have the authority. You can say on your website you have 30 years of experience, but it doesn't seem to hold the same weight in the online world as it does offline. And this has been a huge challenge, is how do we actually determine who has authority and who doesn't? I bet you if you were to speak to any young person, especially because this is who this individual markets to, they would fly, just absolutely he has authority. He's done this, he's spoken to so-and-so, he does this, he does this. Having taken one of his courses, I have realized, no, the guy's blustering. A lot of it's just bull, but he's really great at the smoke and mirror tactics, so that if you are not critically thinking, you're not going to see it. And I am shocked to see, and adults, not just younger ones, but there are some, older adults who have really bought into his authority solely based on his social proof.
And talking about that a little bit, because thinking of people who have been trained, professionals, people who own businesses who either feel late to the game or feel like social media is just really not where they want to get involved, entangled for all kinds of reasons besides being time consuming, also looking at it from a liability standpoint. I'd like to talk a little bit about how the authority of education has to be handled with care online. And I don't know if either of you have comments about that, but I'm happy to start talking about this a little bit from what I've noticed.
I'm happy to let you take this away, Jennifer.
Well, okay, so being a physician, my greatest example of this is the anti-vaccination movement. Started by a celebrity who had quite a bit of social proof. That was her authority. And I think beyond that, she also had what people felt was an authentic platform because she was risking herself. She was putting herself out there. So her opinions about vaccinations and vaccination safety started a worldwide trend that has lasted years and unfortunately many lives. And it was interesting to me because as a physician, practicing physician during this entire time, I waited for, this is very telling that I waited for societies like the Mayo Clinic, the American Medical Association, even the American Congress of OBGYN, and individual physicians to jump online all at once and really give reassurance and give a lot of, really just the facts that we have in evidence for the science behind vaccinations. And even if it's not for, we have science obviously behind every vaccination, but even for specific vaccinations, the ones that are near and dear to my heart for pregnancy, many, many, many years and millions of data points on these vaccination studies. And so long story short, it never came. And I'm not certain if some of that was because of the effect that we see that people online will trust a person before they trust a group of people, and they'll trust a group of people that they can identify before they trust a big nameless, faceless corporation. And if that is the trend, then we definitely didn't see enough individual physicians stand up and say, hey, I'm your neighborhood physician, and here's what I know, and here's what I see, and let me try and kind of break the science down behind this so that, everyone kind of understands why these numbers are, this is such a big deal, because there is a science behind vaccination. And it does require that the majority of the population get vaccinated in order to protect those who absolutely cannot get vaccinated. It's not just if a certain percentage of the population don't get vaccinated, it's no big deal for them. It actually becomes a big deal for quite a large number of the population. So when I noticed this trend over the last decade, then I started paying attention more to who was online. And what I understood is that there's a very big negative whiplash to those whose only authority is that of education, and to those whose educational level and level of attainment is so high that people just can't see themselves even having a cup of coffee with this person. Now, people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and people like Dr. Oz, they've done something very remarkable, very special, and something that I'd like to see more professionals do in order to have a voice online and be part of that public conversation. And it's this concept of having some authenticity in addition to their authority. And I see this authenticity play out by almost in a formulaic fashion. They have a story. They also have risk. And, they risk either stories about themselves. They risk putting themselves out there to begin with. They risk looking foolish. They risk making jokes. There's some degree out there that people really understand that, and they want to, even if they can't be like them as far as their level of attainment educationally, because they're like, well, I'm never going to get an MD degree, or I'm never going to get a PhD. But there's something about them. They've put so much of themselves out there that people purchase from people that they either like or that they want to be like. And these spokespeople have made themselves very likable, but they've also given us so much of themselves that there's certain attributes, there's certain characteristics that we can point to and say, I want to be like that person. And that is how I've seen authority change and definitely shift from the brick and mortar, how many little figures can you have after your name? How many letters can you have after your name? Versus this concept of, well, how much schooling do you have versus how much do I like you or do I want to be like you? Any other comments about this?
Yes. And you actually brought it around, Jennifer, to what I wanted to say. That celebrity had a personal story. She had an autistic son. And I think more than anything, that is what, as a mom, when my kids were a lot younger, I read everything I could to try to protect them, to raise them to adulthood. And I think that that's what it was. These, the Mayo Clinic and the American Medical Association and all of that, you're right, they're faceless. Had they come out and said, these are the stories we can tell of kids who were saved by having been vaccinated, that would have been the proper response. And that's what didn't happen. Great. So we saw the publication and that he fudged his data and all of that. Okay, I read that kind of stuff, but the majority of people, they're not going to even, who cares? To them, they already have equated that celebrity's personal, heartbreaking story with an autistic child to vaccines. Done. And you brought it around. So these doctors who are these celebrities, they have shared of themselves. And I think that that's, again, where it becomes so important to be able to relate. And that's the big shift that's happened. So we've gone from, doctors and authority figures being like up there, away from us, untouchable, to now some of them having bridged that gap so it's more relatable. And we had talked about this earlier, a grade 3 will relate far better to a grade 5 than they will someone who's in high school or an adult. Why? Because their stories are much more similar. So I think that is the piece that if we can bring that, but what does that mean? It means taking risks. It means being not only more authentic, but a little more vulnerable in telling those stories and saying, yeah, this happened to me. And it doesn't have to be the real heartbreaking stuff we've gone through. It can be even stories about struggling with, I have one right now that's around my identity, that it's one little letter is causing such crisis in my life right now because so it's one letter, like as in the alphabet letter, I should say that, versus like a written letter, but I'm Canadian. It's the letter U we use in favorite, color, neighbor. And I'm writing my blogs and realizing my customers are primarily from the US. So to be an authentic Canadian, I keep the U in there and, Word always tells me, wrong spelling. However, my customers are mostly in the US. So if they see that letter U in there, it's going to be a bit jarring to them. They'll realize that there's difference. And I don't want them to see that letter as being the difference. I want them to read what I'm writing and relate to me as a person. So that's the risk I'm struggling with right now. So telling stories like that, I think can help take people who have educations and make them a little more relatable to their customers and clients that they're seeking to work with.
That's great. This is a great conversation. Two things I drew out of this so far. One is this notion of authority. I guess it's not so much authority that we might want. It's just we want people to listen to us, to use a product that we think will work well for them, to use a service we think that they need. And by showing that you care, like as I gave in the example with the surveys, by showing other people that you heard what they said and you acted on it, it's giving you that authority, which is essentially they're focused on you, and now they're going to listen in and perhaps do what you have to tell them. So it's an authority, but kind of a soft authority. And the other thing that I thought about when Jen was talking was the consequences people don't take into account with authority. With authority comes great responsibility, right? And great consequences. And this is never talked about by the online gurus. And Anita mentioned it about being on stage and or having people buy things. And it's very, if you've been to some of these events, it's sort of cultish, because they're up there like doing some Jedi mind tricks on you to get you to do things. It's like, there's some real consequences because you're the authority figure. And we've known years and years in psychology, all these horrible studies where all it had to be demonstrate was this person is the authority, and people will follow and do most anything. And people that have that authority or are told by the gurus, you need to have authority, need to also know that comes along with that is a lot of consequences.
Yeah, along those lines, Matt, I know that you have some studies that talk about that, but just to kind of wrap up this concept of authority, first of all, I think we've talked about here some of the ways people have authority. We definitely haven't covered them exhaustively. We've talked about the traditional concept of educational attainment or even monetary attainment. There is that concept of experience, the authority of experience, which we can see, especially for certain tactics being used, has to be treated with some care because sometimes those tactics are out of date. And we've seen the authority of how authority can actually, like Matt said, that there's consequences to that one of our, just expressing an opinion can have worldwide long-lasting consequences. And I believe that that's what happened here with the anti-vaccination movement. I know that she did not intend for a lot of the negative consequences that have happened. And it's almost like the train that started that's been really difficult to stop, or at least even to slow down. And Matt, could you talk to us a little bit about the studies that we have on some of those authority consequences?
Sure. And this is, you hear me talk about dark psychology. And I use that phrase because the tactics that the gurus tell us to use, social proof, urgency, scarcity, we've talked about some of these in previous episodes, reciprocity, commitment, authority, they just use them as tactics. And so you should use these, but they don't know where it came from and why it's important, why it's powerful. And so the notion of authority comes from some psychological studies done by a guy named Milgram. And Milgram at that time, everybody was interested following World War II with the question, why do good people do bad things? And why do people listen to authority figures even though they're doing horrible things? And this followed on the trials after World War II. Hey, we're just following orders. Milgram wondered, could anybody just follow orders? Or do you have to be sadistic to do these things? And so he brought adults into his laboratory and told them that they were going to be doing a memory experiment. One would be the teacher and one would be the learner. Well, the learner happened to be a research assistant. So the learner is fake. The learner is on the researcher side. The teacher is an actual unknowing adult who came in there for this study. And the thought was, well, in order to teach people, we need to punish them if they get it wrong. So they showed the teacher, who was a subject, brought them in and said, we're going to put the learner in this chair, put their arm in an electrode shock thing. We're going to strap them to their chair, and you're going to read a list of words. And every time they get one wrong, you're going to administer shocks. So the person saw the setup, saw someone strapped into a chair with an electrode, went on their side of the wall where they couldn't see them, and proceeded to read the words. And every time they got one wrong, they were to push a button on a huge electric panel that was marked in 15, 30 volts, 45 volts, all the way up to 450 volts, which was labeled XXX, intense shock. They were already told that the learner had a heart condition. And they would read the words, and every time they got it wrong, which was often because this is a stooge pretending to be a learner, so of course they're getting a lot wrong, they would administer the shock and say, here's 15 volts. They would click a button, which makes an impressive shocking sound, and then they would hear the person on the other side of the wall jolt. Then they would go on, and they would read a list of words. And of course, the learner would get the next one wrong. So they'd say, well, here's 30 volts. And the person would be shocked. And this would continue. At some point, when they hit like 90 volts, they would hear the other person scream on the other side of the wall. They would turn to the authority figure, who is the researcher, dressed only in a lab coat. That's the authority figure. And the authority figure would say, continue, teacher. And he'd go back to the board, read some words. The learner would get it wrong. Okay, 120 volts. And he'd hear the person scream. And he would turn to the researcher, and the researcher would say, you must continue, teacher. And you could see these people are fidgeting, nervous laughter. They're really worried about this other person on the other side of the wall. At some point, the learner is banging on the wall, saying, my heart can't take this. They would turn to the researcher, and the researcher would say, from a script, you must go on. The experiment requires that you continue. That was the only words spoken. And these teachers would continue to shock and shock and shock. And Milgram asked his colleagues ahead of time, how many people do you think would shock somebody to death? And his colleagues were like, oh my gosh, maybe 1% or less, only the sadistic people. When Milgram ran his studies, he found 65% of the teachers killed the learner. And they knowingly did, because once they got up to 400 volts, the screaming stopped and there was silence. Yet they continued to administer the shock because the researcher said, they didn't answer, that's wrong. You must continue. And they would continue to shock the learner.
So wait a minute. The person who is administering the shocks, what was it on their end? Were they in, what was going to happen to them if they didn't administer the shocks?
Nothing. They could have left at any time. And in fact, some did. 35% actually said, I can't do this anymore, or I want to see the learner, unstrap the learner and I want to make sure they're all right, that their heart's okay. 35%. The other 65%, even though they complained, even though they said, I think you should check on them, they would say, this is on you. They turned to the researcher, this is on you. They continued to shock up to 450 volts, XXX, until the learner was silent.
How did they recruit the people that came in to do the shocks? They
offered $4. They put flyers around town. This is done at Yale University. So they put flyers around and come in and do a study of learning and memory, and you'll get $4 and free cab fare or something, and maybe a lunch. That was their reward for participating in the study. So
there was no if you don't do this, we're going to shock you kind of thing?
Absolutely not. In fact, the researcher, the authority figure, read a script. There's only 3 things the researcher could say: continue, teacher, or the experiment requires you to continue, or you must continue. That was it. And once they exhausted that list, if the teacher refused to do it or made other demands, then they would call the experiment off. But they didn't do that. 65% just muttered to themselves, laughed nervously, kept looking over their shoulder, fidgeted. But the experimenter just said, you must continue. And that's all it took for normal, nice, everyday citizens of that town to come in and shock to death somebody else for failing to answer questions because the authority figure stood behind them in a white lab coat.
So I want to talk a little bit about the authority in this experiment. What is classically considered the authority in this experiment? Is the authority considered the researcher, or is it more than that? Because I really want to talk about this.
Well, that's a great question, because now this experiment has been replicated hundreds and hundreds of times. This notion of 60 to 65% has stayed pretty consistent in different trials. So it seems like that is the number of people, but they did all sorts of, they did a variation where the teacher had to put the learner's hand onto the shock plate, and still they got full compliance from some people. They said, well, maybe Yale is the authority, maybe it's fancy lab. So they rebuilt the lab in kind of a dingy part of town in another city, and still they got fewer results. The number went from 65. I don't know what the number was, maybe 50 or 45, but they still got the same effect when it was taken out of Yale. They had the authority figure call in on the phone, that they weren't even present in the room. They had another case where they played a tape recording. You would come into the room and the teacher the teacher, the subject, would plug in a tape recorder and it would give the instructions. So they tried all sorts of variations. And of course, when the authority figure is not in the room on the telephone, the number drastically decreases. When it's done just as a tape recording, drastically decreases. But it's still surprising that people would follow through because somebody on the telephone is saying, you must continue.
So the in-person person matters. The authority of somebody physically being there matters, correct?
Correct. And now, okay, so now we're sharing with everybody what, when the online gurus say you must demonstrate authority, they're doing it online, they're doing it in this particular way, but that's not really how authority works. When you look at the studies of why authority works, we're talking about proximity of the authority, they're live. There's lots of layers and shades and data behind how this can be done correctly to demonstrate authority, none of which is played out in how this is done online.
Well, and I guess, some of us listening, I'm sure, are a little horrified that even recorded people would actually shock anyone to death. I'd like to talk a little bit about an authority we haven't talked about yet, and that's the authority of building a world where obedience is expected. For instance, who would go to all the trouble to do the signups, to get a room, to have a setup that obviously other people have done. So it's that general expectation that, look, other people have done this before you, other people are going to do it after you, other people are going to listen to what I'm saying here, you're just one of many, so just, we're expecting you to be like one of those people. Do you mind talking about that a little bit with the studies and the study data?
Yeah, because we talked in a previous episode about social proof.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that social proof, the researcher was a guy named Solomon Asch. His student was Stanley Milgram, the guy we're talking about right now. So
okay.
Quite a lab they had going there at Yale. But they combined social proof. While the teacher was instructing the learner and shocking them, they would have other stooges, other research assistants pretending to be other teachers in the room who are also shocking other people. So that it made it less, made that subject less nervous. He's looking around and other teachers are also shocking other people in other hidden rooms. And of course, compliance increases. But when they saw those other teachers back away and say, well, I don't want any part of this, then the only subject in the room would then also say, I guess it's okay for me to back out of this now, social proof going on.
Yeah, I think this concept, because really a lot of what we're doing, especially in online worlds, we have way more latitude than we're giving ourselves credit for. And so this concept of world building is very fascinating to me. Both due to the power as well as due to, and this is why I want to have a conversation about a lot of these tactics, because these tactics absolutely are boundaries for which we create our worlds, but it is easy to create a world, easier than it should be, right? According to these studies, to create a world where obedience is expected and social proof is used to back up that expectation, to go along with whatever we'd like people to go along with, whether that is buying into an identity, a sale, etc. Do you have comments? I see Anita.
I guess I have to unmute myself for you to hear me.
Yep.
So again, when in the online world, God, I'm so excited by this. I can't even get it out of my mouth. Have tried to take, I guess, this group environment that is very difficult to have when you have people just, dispersed across the world. Facebook groups are one of the most popular ways to then bring your groups together, or your customers, your clients, to have discussions, to get to know each other a little better, to have, to release new material, to encourage, to support. And I have seen, though, that if you have a dissenting voice, or sometimes even question the authority or what authority of the individual who owns that group, I've seen plenty of people just kicked out. Just, we don't want you. You are not being obedient. And they often have like a set of rules that you must follow. And I was curious about this one guy. So I followed his whole process. 32 different steps you had to go through to get access to his group. And he had an extensive list of rules. And it was to the point where people were almost afraid to post lest they get kicked out of this group. And he had grown this group very quickly. I think he had 18,000 members within 8 months. He knew what he was doing, but I hated it. I hated it in there. So I removed myself because I'm somebody who likes to question. And I think, again, if we have that caring for our customers, for our clients, and we are vulnerable to, opening ourselves up just that little bit, then instead of seeing those dissenting voices as being negative and questioning, we can, if we truly have the authority to speak on what we're speaking about, then welcome it, because we can learn a lot from those questions that are being asked. And I see it as the authority. So these individuals who, I've watched people get kicked off of phone calls that they have paid to be on, in these groups sometimes that they've paid to be in. And I think it's because they question the authority, and that authority has not been overly well established. So the easiest way to deal with it is just kick the person out. Just get rid of them. We don't want them in the group anymore. And so I've seen that. I've seen the other tactic where posts that raise any questions or doubts are just deleted by admin, so nobody gets a chance to see them. So that's how it plays out there, that we demand obedience. These are our rules. If you want to be part of our community, you must abide by them. And we have people who are making sure that you do. And some groups are even strict enough, like this one guy who had his 32 steps. You got one chance, you got plenty of warnings, you mess up, you are done. To me, that doesn't foster a growth community. That fosters fear and absolute obedience, and speaks to more his control over the people in his group than it does in my group, where I want people to ask questions. And those dissenting voices, they do have a place, because maybe there is something I haven't seen. Maybe, they might be difficult to answer, but I want to hear, because maybe I can learn something new that could benefit all of us.
Yeah. And, and that's shameful, because as humans, we look to authority figures. The person in the white lab coat, bam, in Milgram's study, 65% comply with whatever he says because he's wearing a lab coat. So I think just as humans, we tend to, look towards authority figures and assume that they know what they're doing, and we should follow that. So people that take advantage of that, it is shameful.
Well, and I have a little different view on that, especially for Facebook groups. It goes to the concept of world building, but I think if someone has either a process or a product or whatever it is, and they decide that they've built their world, I will give an excellent example of this. This would be Steve Jobs and iTunes. I cannot tell you the amount of people that do not love iTunes. They feel that it is, yeah, there you go. And, my attitude towards that is, if you love it, join. If you don't. And that was also his attitude as the content creator with it. And I think this would be one thing if we had a world where we had limited to no options, or it was required to be a part of these groups. Obviously, there's a discussion if you paid for something and you're, removed, that's a different discussion. But again, because we have the power to world build our realities, our rules, using obedience and authority using authority to establish obedience, while this is a tactic, while this is what I consider a necessary part of forming any group. Using it with that grain of salt that Dr. Champagne likes to say, it does need to be used carefully. It does have consequences. It has more power than we give it credit for. And I think that all these points are really wonderfully well taken, because if you happen to be somebody that really doesn't love the rules of that group, but were, dismissed unfairly or dismissed out of hand, it's easy to make enemies, and there's different ways that people will respond, react, and retaliate online than we're used to in real life. So these are just issues that we wanted to make people aware of, the positive and the negative of them. And any other thoughts in kind of wrapping this all up?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like every episode, I just would like everyone to be aware of the depth and the background of all these tactics. Looking at it, it's as silly to me as if somebody said, well, you know what love is. Love, to satisfy love, to check love off, buy your sweetheart a dozen roses. Okay, check. You've demonstrated love. And you're like, well, that didn't make any sense. Like, love is so deep, and there's so many complexities and shades and different people see it differently. How can you say that did it? Well, I feel the same way about everything the gurus are saying about social proof and reciprocity and authority. To just say, here's how you demonstrate authority, do this, check. To me, it's just as silly as the love example. So when you dig deeper, when you look at the original studies where these concepts came from, all the variations, all the variables that are involved in making this work, and it's just very deep. And I invite everybody to look a little closer at these. And when you hear a guru say, just do this to get the social proof and do this to get the scarcity, just know that there's so much more, and you can really stand out. You're not, if you're in competition with others, it'd be great to know the background, because you really will have a competitive advantage over everyone if you know these concepts a little more deeply.
Do either one of you feel that people in authority can have relationship with their groups? I think that there is a group of people out there that feel that if they are an authority, that they are removed, and that as an authority, it's not really a relationship if they're doing their job, it's something else. Do you mind talking to that a little bit?
Yeah, and that made me think of, when you hear about this, you must have these things, social proof and authority and scarcity and urgency. No, you don't. You don't. You know why they say that? Because all 6 of them were in one book. There's a researcher that published a book some 20 years ago that had those 6 concepts in it. So somebody read the book and said, oh, those must be the 6 concepts to have. And now it's like, you must have these. Well, no, you don't really. It's not as simple as that. I mean, a lot of these concepts came from copywriting, going back over a century or more. But it's not a checklist sort of approach. So, I'm an authority in a very specific niche. I can't teach you how to improve your golf swing or your tennis swing. I can't tell you how to raise your kids. I mean, there's a million things I can't teach you, and I'm of no authority. But I do have this one area I'm an authority in. And so I use that to say, take everything that I've learned and I know about this, I want to share it with you. And I want to excite people who see it as exciting as I do, that there's a lot of possibility and so much can be done knowing something about this topic. It's going to repel some people because they think it's not for them. But I do use my authority to, say, I'm not a 5th grader and you're not a 3rd grader. Like, I'm actually far ahead of you in this particular area. But I do want to share with you all these things. So I think authority is, of course, it's an incredibly useful concept, but I don't see it as something that's on a checklist. And I'm probably straying off your original question there, but I'm just kind of
about relationship. You're demonstrating what my opinion on it is. But Anita, go ahead first. I know you wanted to say something.
Thanks,
I think there was an insult in there somewhere. I'll think about that.
No, actually, it had to do with servant leadership and the fact that I think that there can be a relationship through servant leadership, and you were demonstrating that by serving your audience, by showing them these concepts. So see, it was nice.
Okay.
So I was going to in response to Jennifer's question about, I think that there are some authority figures who do have a relationship with their customers or clients. Again, Facebook is the world that I live in, and oftentimes the Facebook groups, one of the best ways to do this is a Facebook Live. So it can be on a Q&A or people. So there's all sorts of different ways you can do it. You can have people submit their questions in advance. You can have people submit their questions right there while you're live and answering them. And this, it does wonders in that relatability, in feeling more connected to the person who's, the authority figure. They feel like they have more of a relationship with them. And interestingly, I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and there's a big digital marketer, and she's saying, like, when she's on a Facebook Live and her dog walks in the room and it's, in the background walking past, she says the comments just go crazy over her dog having just walked into the frame. And people just love that. Why? Because again, it makes her more relatable, even though she's, a multi-million-dollar a year business owner. That just kind of brings her from up there to down here really quickly. And so, yeah, there are ways that we can develop relationships, but it involves our time. It involves us being a little more vulnerable. It involves us opening up a little more and allowing people to find the different things that make us more relatable to them.
That's a great point. I was just thinking about that, for those professionals, because I've been lately trying to do the same myself, because I love to cruise. I love to scuba dive. I have a rock band. There's all these little things about me that I want to find other people who are in bands, who love to cruise, who love to scuba dive. And I want to have that kind of relationship them as well. So I do think it's quite possible to have both, to be an authority in your niche, but also want to interact with people who like the same things that you do.
I think we so missed it for the cover for this, where, the media marketing, we really needed to have Matt on the cover, playing his guitar in the band, and also scuba diving. Like, he's in one corner and then the other corner. We just totally missed the mark. Maybe next season we'll have to consider that.
I won't show you pictures they just took at an 80s party I was at this past weekend there. So
those need to go online. Those need to go online. Well, just to kind of summarize then, my opinion about all of it is that, again, these tactics where we use authority to expect obedience, it's a world building strategy that, boy, you can build whatever world you want, as we've been discussing, even in the 21st century, even when we're recording this, you can build a feudal society in Facebook groups. You can build a democratic society. And, it all depends on the level of buy-in that we really want with our audience. And we're speaking to those who are interested in media marketing, and the kind of marketing that builds relationship, and the kind of marketing where people want to buy in, and they want to buy in even more over time, which Dr. Champagne has demonstrated with how he does survey, which is our first example of a media marketing technique in our first season that we're really going into in depth. So from the three of us, the lovely Anita Toth.
Hi.
The very well educated Dr. Matthew Champagne.
In a small area.
And for myself, Dr. Jennifer Breton, have a wonderful rest of your day or evening or morning, and we will see you the next episode.